Well, I think we might as well go ahead and get started. We may have some other folks join us. Just to let you know, we are going to record this session, but we will remove any personally identifiable video or names or anything before we post it. But we just want to capture Peter's explanation of finding water in the landscape, and some of the Q&A I think might be helpful for others as well. So thank you for joining us for our May Globe Observer Connect session. This is the second one of these that we've done. And the idea is to have a chance for people to have a conversation and interact with our subject matter experts. In this case, our expert is Peder Nelson, who is the science lead for the Globe Observer land cover tool. I see he changed his background location to a new location. But without further ado, I'll just let Peder take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Kristen. I really am excited to be here, and hope that this is a worthwhile time for everybody who is involved here and also might watch it at a later date. I'm going to hop on here and share my screen so that we can have a little interactivity with our time tonight. So I wanted to just kind of start off with our blog that we wrote up introducing this interesting science challenge of just trying to document or map where water is located on our landscape. And I'll point out, with the photo behind me, people and water tend to go together an awful lot. Sometimes, there's actually industry right next to it that is using the power of water. Other times, people are living right next to water, because those are some of the places that really help humans survive. We need water, and it also tends to be places where, depending on the time of year, that water may be there or may not be there. And so there's a lot of reasons for that. But importantly, this is one of those fundamental pieces of science that we're trying to document, not only from space, but also, here on the ground. And part of that is just the big water cycle that's happening. Sometimes that water is up in the sky, sometimes it's on the ground. And since people aren't able to see very far on the ground, as you can see from this field of view behind me, I can only see a little distance. This view from space that we have, this satellite image view, really allows us to map out the extent or how much area water covers on the globe or in an area. And again, importantly, because we have these nice consistent measurements coming from our space sensors, we're able to look at this sometimes throughout the day, sometimes throughout the week, sometimes throughout the seasons. And so this is a fundamental piece that we're trying to track, because where water's located, and whether it's snow or whether it's liquid water like a river or a lake, is really a foundational piece to a lot of important parts of what makes Earth and this wonderful place to live on. And by that, again, we see this dynamic nature where even things that we think are constant, like rivers, are actually changing and bending. And over time, we can see this really interesting influence of the geology as well as what people are doing to the landscape. So that was part of the reason why we wanted to invite people to be involved in this particular challenge, because water is not constant. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there. In other cases, it feels like it's always there. And there are these places that I want to highlight, that are really important, because they are this place between solid ground where we can usually walk, like what Dr. Rusty Lowe is showing here, where she's able to stand on some soil. But as she's looking out towards that water body that's always there, or at least it looks like it on the map, there is that wetland area. And so that's a place where vegetation sometimes really likes to have their feet wet. And so depending on where you're looking or how you want to label this, the places like this, the water can be very obvious. In other cases, it can be hidden by this vegetation layer. And in this vegetation layer is where you might find things like mosquitoes or birds or other wildlife that is using that vegetation and water. So it becomes a really important part of just organisms on Earth. And so as a result of that, we really want to be paying attention to what's happening to these places as the air temperature warms up and or cools down. And what's important about that is in the northern hemisphere, we're getting air temperatures are raising, and that's allowing mosquito habitat to become active. And so there will be the vegetation that the mosquitoes need to eat. There's also the water that they need to be able to populate and breed in. And then also there are all the other organisms that like to eat the mosquitoes and the mosquito larvae. And so there's this really dynamic web of life that is happening as we go through a change of our seasons, as temperatures warm up and as water starts flowing through our landscapes. Importantly, in this location, Dr. Lowe wanted to really highlight how areas that seem like they're water today may not actually be natural water bodies. In this case, we're in a location near her where she was doing those observations. We can go back and do a little bit of time traveling to look back at what these places might have looked like before today. And so Dr. Lowe asked me to help her pull in some satellite images to do some of this time traveling. And as a result, we were able to do a quick comparison between what it looked like in 1984 and then what it looked like in a recent image in the year 2021. And that really corresponds well with these ground photos that she was able to find for this location. And so, when she goes out there today, it is this water body where you can see the surface water. It's blue, and that's very similar here in our satellite image that we have for the year 2021. Kind of similar. And here we can see what's blue or blackish color is that water. But if we go back in time, again, to 1984 and kind of the beginning of our satellite measurements, we see that it's more of this pink color or maybe a little bit of green. And that really corresponds well with an image that she provided, which we don't know the date of, but it seems to correspond with what we see from space, from that satellite perspective. So this is a really wonderful example of how these ground photos can be used together with some information from satellites to put together maybe when this changed from a bare area to a water body. And so we dug a little bit deeper and we were able to identify the time period between, say, 1996 and 1997, when it appeared that this area transitioned from bare land cover to a water covered land cover type. And so since we don't have any ground photos, we have to use the satellite images to pinpoint when that transition occurs. So that's one of those things that even if we're only able to get observations on the ground at a moment in time, hopefully NASA and all the other space agencies are doing a good job of doing their part and taking images of Earth from space in a way that allows us to connect what we see on the ground to these processes that are happening. In this case, what humans are doing. But what's really, I think, exciting is to not just focus on humans. That tends to be the place where we live. So we see a lot of impacts or changes as a result of that. The picture I have is an example of a paper factory, actually, that's on the river. And so whether it be dredging the rocks and then turning those into buildings or streets like concrete, or whether it be, again, using that water power to produce materials that we might use, water is all around us. And it's a really fascinating piece that I just invite you to pay attention to, slow down. Because as we really focus here on our data challenge, I want to go down in case you're not aware, but if you scroll down on our challenge page, you can start to see at least where people are contributing from and the variety of photos that people are contributing. So I think this is a pretty good start for our Where's the Water challenge. We can see that we're actually getting a good area. Everyone who's on here, I encourage you to put yourself on that map and make sure that you're getting your observations into this database so that we can do this next piece. Because this isn't just about scientists like me and my colleagues gathering ground information through sensors and things like that. It's actually to give you the power to pay attention to what's happening around you. And I want to switch over and highlight, how important tracking water is. And right now, there are places around the globe that are experiencing flooding. And so if you go to NASA's Worldview website, you can actually explore what they're seeing from space and where water is actually going in places that it usually isn't. Now, this is something that you could use to keep yourself safe, as well as a way that you can look at what is happening on Earth. So you can just click on and do a little search for just this first one of where the flooding might be occurring. And so I want to move this up a little bit and notice it takes us to a particular date. I'm going to move us to current, not 1948, but 2023. And here we can actually see what is happening on Earth today in this way. And so I'm going to just zoom in on a particular area and just highlight what we're starting to see from space. And I know there is this large river that's currently going through the United States here that we can see is experiencing a little bit of flooding in various places. And so these red areas are potential flood areas that are occurring. And then we have areas where it's usual water. And so watching water from space is a really important thing. But I want to highlight here that these gray areas actually are places where there's clouds. And so we can't see what's happening on the ground from space sometimes, especially when it's raining or there's clouds in the sky that block this satellite view. So that's where our ground photos really become incredibly valuable to walk us through and show us what's happening underneath the clouds. So I'm going to quickly just show you an example of one of the locations that has come in here in the middle of the United States, because I think this is a great example of a little bit of filling in the field notes with some information that, in this case, they use the sometimes water notation, and they described a little bit of what they're seeing. And here we can flip to the photos and we can actually see a variety of what we see on the ground from this location. And I'm going to just focus on this photo here and wrap up a little bit of my talk here because I want to answer some questions. But to me, this is a really interesting piece of doing remote sensing with your mobile device on the ground, is that water is very obvious to us, but sometimes it has this reflection that makes it hard for a computer or other things to recognize that as water. We can actually see it's sort of green in some places, and then it's actually clear in some other places as it gets closer to us. So this is one of those challenges of trying to identify where water is located. Is it can look blue sometimes, like what's behind me, or it can actually look green or gray or whatever's near the shore. So add some of that information to your field notes, because that helps everybody to understand what we're seeing and why we're seeing it, and interesting things like that. The other piece I want to highlight about how these ground photos can be really valuable and really interesting is along the shoreline, we can actually see some trees that are down along the river shore. And then I'm going to zoom in here because right in the middle is a tree that is no longer growing. It has been uprooted and moved down the river, and now it's sitting on this gravel bar. That tells us something about maybe the water level other times of the year that can move a big log like this. The other thing that I noticed here is in this image, there's actually another black object or something like that that was on the gravel bar. And so I actually went right back here and noticed that there was a mosquito habitat mapper photo that was included. And here I could actually see that it is a tire, which is prime mosquito habitat. And this tire, appears to be transported or moved down. I don't see a road nearby. So I don't know how else that tire might have actually shown up there. But one of the things to note is that, this can be a really nice place for mosquito habitat because of the black that warms things up and also the water that pools and collects there. So what I really like about the sequence of photos is that it demonstrates how we can get a wide perspective with the land cover photos like this. And then we can also switch over and sometimes get really detailed information about a particular object that is important for something that we're trying to monitor, like mosquito habitat. And I noticed here, this person did quite a few photos of that from different directions so that we can see some of the details and how it's situating in the landscape. So this was a great example of what you might find out there. That's not just water. Sometimes there's other things that are just tell us about what's happening in the area. And clearly there's some humans around because there's this unnatural tire that has been transported down the stream. So to me, that is some of the things that I'm starting to see in the data that's being submitted into our science and education database. So with that, I'm just going to actually go back to our wonderful flood map right here. And I'm going to open it up and see, do we have any questions from some of the people who are joining us today?
Well, and I'll start this out, Peter. I think you've already touched on the field notes, but for the challenge, we're asking people to put #water in the field notes, and you've already described some of the things that are helpful. But are there other particular things that are most useful in terms of what notes to put in those field notes on a regular basis? Not just for this challenge where we're asking people to say #water, but just in general, what is most helpful for you when you're looking at those photos?
So what is most helpful, not only to me, but to anybody who looks at these photos or tries to use this data for research or just to learn about the world, is to describe some of what is in the landscape. As I highlighted there in that little sequence, sometimes the images don't get all those details that you as a human might actually see. So in this case, we noted that there was a tire in that location. So that would be a wonderful thing to add to the field notes because it's something that may not be obvious when you look at the picture. Also, some of the things to keep track of are the temperature of the day. You can just write in, it's a hot day or it's a cold day. Some of those characteristics are really useful to just give us a sense for what's happening if we're not able to make a more precise measurement using an instrument. And so these field notes are just a great way to remind not only yourself of what you were seeing, but to provide some context that it will provide other people the ability to repeat your process. And that's the science piece, right? So when you write those field notes, don't just write them for yourself, but also think about a general audience and other people who might read it and really try to give them a sense for that location. Those are some of my tips. I also, like what we highlighted here, there's some specific keywords that you can use, like water or land or green or blue or some of those kinds of things that are also really, really helpful for searching and for discovering what's out there in these photos. So that's a great one because it is an open note piece for people to provide your insights.
And is there anything else? What else can we do to make sure these observations are most helpful for people looking at it in terms of the location and other things that you might suggest to make sure that the data is the most useful for later use?
Yeah, I mean, so again, part of our goal here is to produce science data. And in that way, the Globe Observer Land Cover Protocol walks you through a series of steps that have you record the time, which is an important characteristic. So check that. The next thing is check your location and make sure that you are recording yourself in the right place. Because as I was highlighting, when we start to actually compare it to satellite data, we need to make sure that what you're talking about or what you're observing on the ground is in the same location as what the satellites are recording. So pay attention to that location piece and the map piece, because that is an important part and might limit what we end up being able to do if your point ends up in a different country, or even in some cases just being about a kilometer off or a mile off, can make it really challenging to compare it to the satellite data. So those are two really, really important things that slow down and make sure that you are recording those things, because you're doing science here, and science requires a little bit of thoughtfulness. And so even though your mobile app is recording some of these things, do check that it's recording the right numbers. And so those are some of the recommendations and pieces that the tool slows you down. It has you walk through this process because we want you to pay attention to the data that you're producing. Because ultimately, as I was pointing out here, when somebody goes to look at it, one of the things that is recorded is the accuracy of this measurement. And so there is a way that we can see this, and you can even double check that what you recorded is in the right place on Earth. And all of that is necessary if we want to do NASA type of science, which is connected to the satellite imagery. So that place piece is really challenging sometimes, but it's also one of the most important pieces that we can go through.
And I think it's easy to overlook in the app that round circle that says like reset location, that'll allow you to get that most accurate. I mean, that was 4-meter accuracy, the one you were just showing us. So if you make sure you get that, refresh that until it gets as low as possible, that's going to mean that you have the best location accuracy for those photos. Gabriela, please go ahead.
Perfect. And my question is, how or why desert places change to water bodies?
So that's a great question. That depends on where you are in the world. And in some places, an area will turn into water bodies because there's just a little shallow depression or an area that allows water to gather in that location. Now, whether the water comes from the sky or in rain, and you just have a lot of water that comes down at a period of time, like turning on a shower in a bathtub or in a shower, or whether there is a constant flow of water, either coming from the sky, that happens in some places, it rains every day, or there are places where snow is and water is frozen up in the mountains. And as temperatures warm up, that snow melt or snow and ice will melt and turn into liquid water and start coming down. And that's part of what we see in the change of seasons is water going from frozen to liquid, sometimes back to frozen. And so, Gabriela, it's a really interesting question that depends on where you are. And one of the things that to be able to answer a question of why is water in that location, you have to go back to that location many times to see, when does the water come? Is there time of year where that water shows up? Like, is it May? Or is there also a time of day? This is another interesting thing, is sometimes there's a certain time of day where the snow will melt and you will actually get more water coming down and going into those low places. So we really have to think about how much of the area can we see. And I'll just quickly go back that, if we go to the photos that I was looking at earlier, that we were all looking at earlier, here I don't know why the water is there. It looks flat to me, right? And so this picture doesn't really tell me much about why water's there. And sometimes you can see that river flowing. Other times, a single picture doesn't really tell us that information. And that's where, if we go to something like a satellite image, we can start to see the water bodies, in this case, winding down from one location to another location. And sometimes we can follow that all the way up to maybe a source or a water body upstream that is providing all of that river water. So that's a great question that is part of the investigation. Why might there be surface water like what's behind me on your landscape? And there's a lot of reasons. And I just want to point out, like here, this area is experiencing a lot of flooding right now. And we can follow that up. And the reason is because up in this area, there's a lot of snow that's melting right now. So Gabriela, what do you think why do you think there's water in your area near you in Colombia?
Well, I'm from Colombia, that's right, and I live in Pereira. So here's this big volcano with a lot of snow in the point, and that's why we have I consider it a big river that is with a lot of water that is called the Rio Tun. So I think that is one of the most big water bodies here.
Yeah, and that's a great example. I'm playing with my map right now because I want to take you to one of the places. I'm hoping that it will show up here on this map, but nope, it's under cloud cover. So let me just go back a day or two and see if we can actually get it. But volcanoes are one of those places where you do find a lot of water pooling because, let's see if I can actually get it, because they tend to have depressions in them. And so I'll just point out that where I'm located, we actually have one of the deepest water bodies that's sitting in a volcano. And that's one of those really interesting things that until that volcano erupted and lost its top, that water was sitting in snow or flowing off the top. Now that the volcano no longer has the top of the mountain, it's a perfect place for that water to pool and snow melt to go into. And that's actually this area right here that we see. It's this nice perfect circle. So Gabriela, I can relate to what you're talking about in terms of the mountains holding some interesting places of water that then give us these great rivers. I'd love to see some pictures.
Yeah, and actually, what you're saying, if there's an explosion from the volcano, there is going to be an affection in the water bodies. Actually, that volcano that I told you is in this moment in orange alert because if in any moment it explodes, it's going to affect to mash this area. So
We are at the half past the hour, so I think we need to wrap up pretty soon. But I think this just emphasizes, yeah, there's Crater Lake, how important this context is, and the background details of where you think the water's coming from that Peter was talking about. And also, it seems like also if it's rained recently, things like that, not as solid and permanent as a volcano being there, but even more things like it rained a lot in the last few weeks, and that's why there's water. Any of those details are really helpful to add the context for these photos that can fill in those gaps between the satellite data. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Peter, for sharing your expertise. And we look forward to chatting more about water and to seeing all the water photos that come in over the next month through the end of May. Take care, everybody.